In our previous panel, we talked about one thing that every pilot has in common, regardless of the equipment they fly. The color of your uniform or what you carry in the back. That's your medical ticket. Now there's one other thing we all share that's just as integral to our jobs, and that doesn't care what, where, or whom you fly. That would be the airspace that we operate in. The airspace system itself is as dynamic as our flights within it. The technology changes, both in our airplanes and on the ground. Policies and regulations change, routes change, even the very nature of the aircraft in the airspace changes. The airspace system has to keep up with all of that. The lineup for our last panel covers a wide variety of views on how, or perhaps even if, the airspace system needs to adapt to changes. Our panel moderator is no stranger certainly to this audience. It is our own Captain Sean Cassidy, ALPA's first VP and National Safety Coordinator. Sean is one of several senior ALPA representatives on groups helping to define how we can collaborate to ensure airspace in which we fly is not only the safest, but the most efficient it can be. So, Sean, take it away.
Thanks, Chuck. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for hanging in here with us. I think that you're going to find this panel exceptionally interesting. You're going to have some great conversations. And for those of you joining us for the panel, you're also going to be rewarded with a great presentation from a former astronaut who now is a member of SpaceX. And I think probably some of the things that we're going to talk about possibly during this panel might even tie into some of the comments that Mr. Reisman will have for us in a little bit. One of the biggest challenges that I have sometimes is if I look out and see a group of 10 pilots and I ask them, what is NextGen? Typically, even though we are the practitioners of NextGen, we're the practitioners of the technology, sometimes it's actually very difficult to even define the term. And if you can't really define the term, then how do you know what your role is in driving these programs forward? So my answer to them is NextGen is simply the application of policies, procedures, and equipage which drives up the efficiency of our transportation system and does so while maintaining or enhancing aggregate levels of safety and security. And even that might be a little bit difficult to do, but even more difficult is how do we get from fix to fix while the airspace system still has to be a 24/7 operation. It's kind of like trying to change the tires in a car as you're speeding down the road, but we must do it, right? So today we've heard panels discussing several aspects of how pilots are getting the job done safely and securely. We've heard discussions of security threats and countermeasures, listened to the FAA, Transport Canada, and ICAO provide their perspectives on key safety issues, and heard leading aviation medical experts provide information on occupational safety and health issues affecting the flight deck. For our final panel of the Air Safety Forum, our group of aviation experts will discuss the flight plan, the promise, and yes, even the potholes of the NextGen air traffic control system. Since the introduction of jets into the National Airspace System, what we call the NAS, over 50 years ago, the world of commercial aviation has certainly changed dramatically. Aircraft fly more passengers, carry more cargo, fly higher, faster, further, and consume a lot less gas than the platforms that we flew not too long ago. Compare what a 777 does right now versus a Boeing 707. The number of annual aircraft operations has also increased exponentially, but the number of accidents has actually dropped to an all-time low, and the level of safety in the NAS has never, ever been higher. As pilots, we're always looking for new pilot-centric tools that improve our ability to aviate, navigate, and communicate, yet won't overwhelm us or degrade flight safety. We want tools that can be used expeditiously and be rolled out and easily assimilated. However, when you think about it, the ATC system that we're in right now really does a lot of things much the way they did it decades ago. We still use radar surveillance, we still do most of our control via voice communications, and we still receive vectors to final most of the time. Despite increased demand for ever-increasing capacity and efficiency, the ATC system still must continue to evolve. For the past 15 years, NextGen has been heralded as a game changer. Gradually, we've seen progress towards space-based navigation like RNAV and RMP, controller pilot data link communications, CPDLC, and ADS surveillance, which has really come into focus, especially in the wake of the Malaysia 370 tragedy. Much of the progress that has been made in oceanic and other relatively low volume traffic areas have not really been exported into the NAS, and more extensive change has to occur. Change is an inevitable byproduct of a transition to NextGen. New equipment, procedures, ATC training, corporate culture, and on and on. Change means the same old ways of doing business will not work looking forward. Change requires strong FAA leadership. Change requires moving towards a more nimble corporate model that is able and willing to make tough decisions in a timely manner and then execute on them. Our panel today will look at NextGen, the good, the bad, and the ugly. We'll discuss where we've been, how we got there, where we need to go, and the impacts on various segments of our industry and the lessons we've learned along the way. Let me give you a little bit of a reference point for the reason I chose the word potholes in the title. I grew up upstate, up near New York City. And whenever we'd have to drive anywhere, we'd basically have to have a bucket full of coins to go through all the toll booths, right? And so it was a very tedious process going from toll booth to toll booth to toll booth. And, throw on top of that an accident or some kind of traffic delay. And it was a really, really tedious thing. Now I can get in my car here in Washington, D.C., have a transponder that's on my windshield, and go through every single toll plaza from here back to my old house without ever having to stop once and fish out for money. In my home state of Washington, back in May of 2013, there was a bridge that collapsed over the Skagit River, and it basically severed a portion of Interstate 5 between Seattle and Vancouver. Now, obviously, that was an urgent enough situation that a quick and timely decision was made and was executed. And it didn't take months, and it didn't take years, and it certainly didn't take a decade to do something about it. They had 2 replacement spans up in place 1 month later. The question then becomes, if we understand the urgency of when things happen on the ground, if we understand and can relate to potholes, to bridge collapses and everything else, and we also understand the importance of our aviation industry, how can we not figure a plan to explain that importance and to execute on moving these programs forward? So to join me in the discussion, from your left to your right, I'm very pleased to introduce Marla Westervelt. Marla works with the Eno Center for Transportation, and she's kind of essentially play the role of Switzerland in this conversation this afternoon, because what they do is they look at multimodal transportation issues. They grab panels of experts, very knowledgeable folks, and they look to provide recommendations. To Marla's left is Bob Poole. Bob works for, and actually basically started something called the Reason Foundation. Bob has been a transportation expert for many, many years, especially with respect to funding issues. And he provides a report under the Reason Foundation banner. His legacy goes back to many, many administrations, and as well as the FAA, where he has been a trusted advisor for transportation issues and funding. You're going to kind of cross the Mason-Dixon line to Ed Bolen here. Ed is with the National Business Aviation Association, and Ed, too, is another tremendous expert in the world of aviation transportation. In fact, he was appointed back in 1981 by George Bush as an advisor on how we could modernize our airspace system. And his legacy continues in many, many high-level boards, to include the Management Advisory Council at the FAA, worked with them on the NAC and various other things. A tremendously smart gentleman. And to Ed's left is my good friend Mel Davis. Mel Davis, affectionately I call him Too Tall. And Mel has 27 years of frontline ATC experience. Mel is also Mr. NextGen in the FAA. He basically is the focus point for how we bring equipage policies and procedures and execute on them in the line of business under the air traffic organization at the FAA. We're tremendously blessed to have all these folks here, and it's a great privilege to work with all of them. And I would also note that that Mel and I also both serve on the Board of Advisors, where we're making sure that we carry our perspective on pilot and controller-centric solutions to NextGen airspace modernization. So I'm going to go have a seat over there and join everybody, and then what we're going to do is I'm going to invite opening comments. And while you're listening to our speakers provide their opening comments, please do me a favor, listen very carefully, and if you have any questions, please start writing them down so we can continue this conversation moving forward. Marla.
Thanks so much, Sean. As Sean mentioned, I'm with the Center for Transportation, which is a transportation policy think tank. One of the most effective things that we're able to do as a research institution is identify larger transportation policy challenges and, as a neutral convener, bring together key stakeholders and industry leaders to discuss best possible avenues forward. A couple of years ago, we came to you, the aviation industry, and we asked you what you thought your biggest challenges were. Through these conversations, we found that the biggest issue was the languishing implementation of NextGen. So we brought together a NextGen working group, and ALPA, along with everyone else in this panel, has joined together on this working group. Our group began to discuss the barriers to NextGen implementation, and we found that modernization was inherently linked to the funding and the governance structure of air traffic control. As you know, U.S. air traffic control is operated by the Federal Aviation Administration, and it is funded through the Airports and Airways Trust Fund and the General Fund. As a governmental structure, it is subject to annual appropriations along with government procurement. Air traffic control is the only transportation service in the federal government that is operated by the federal government. It is also the only service that is operated and regulated by the same entity, which is highly unusual. As a result of this governance structure, we have been experiencing inconsistent federal funding, as well as what some may say, too much government intervention. Discussing these challenges, the working group agreed that we should look into how to potentially reform this system. We began by looking at how the system came to be what it is today. And we also looked into the attempts at reform that have been made multiple times since the 1980s. We found that each attempt at reform was stopped by the stakeholders not agreeing on what they wanted that reform to look like. Also extremely important to our research has been looking into what our international peers have done. We have found that many of our peers over the last 25 years have reformed their systems, and they've been able to implement modernization technologies such as NextGen at a much faster level than we have been able to. We've identified three primary structures. The first structure is keeping air traffic control operation within the federal government or national government, but separating it out from regulation, as is the case in France. Another, and probably the most prevalent model, has been the government corporation. This model can be found in Germany as well as Australia. And the final model, which is only found in Canada, is taking air traffic control operation entirely out of the national government and having it operated by a nonprofit organization. Currently, our working group is looking at each of these models and discussing with ourselves, the stakeholders, what you feel is the best way for us to move forward and what model would best fit your needs. The ultimate aim of our group is to help you make this decision and help you then bring this decision to the table. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Over to you, Bob.
Thanks. I've been working on aviation policy, air traffic control reform ideas for about 30 years. And have reached a number of conclusions, but about 3 years ago, another group, the Business Roundtable, approached me and some other people to create also a working group that's been working for that three-year period to come up with a proposal for an air traffic corporation. And we've had a lot of discussions with all the key stakeholders. We've concluded there are at least 5 important reasons why we need to do a reform, and Marla kind of alluded to some of them. Number one that almost everybody agrees on is the funding situation has become very unstable and unpredictable. And this has led to triage going on right now. The NAC is basically triaging investments because there simply isn't enough money, and you can't plan out what money's going to be there 3 years from now, 5 years from now. So people can't plan on equipping and know that when they equip, there's going to actually be a system there that will give them benefits. Another problem that's quite severe for the FAA as a federal bureaucracy is what we might call technology lag, that the decision cycle time within FAA tends to be longer than the innovation cycle in avionics, so that by the time you finally get to a decision and implement something, it's no longer the state of the art. And this is a real problem for a system that needs to stay with the state of the art and be a leading system. Another problem institutionally is that the way things work, when you pay attention to the source that provides your funding, and even though the user taxes pay for most of the cost of the system, the money actually comes from Congress. Congress appropriates it every year, and they always give a lot of directives of how that money is going to be spent, and they limit what you can do, or they mandate what you can do, and they have tremendous amount of oversight because they define it as taxpayers' money and they have to be responsible for it. Well, that means the de facto focus of FAA is a lot focused on Congress, on doing pleasing Congress, because that's where the money comes from. But the focus really should be on pleasing the customers who are using the system and the people working in the system and doing what they believe is best. And so that I see as another governance problem. And finally, the question that Marla mentioned, that of operations versus regulation. Being in the same entity is recognized in most other parts of the U.S. government as inherently a conflict. It's recognized by ICAO as of about a decade ago as something that should be organizationally separate, and almost every certainly every leading Western country, let's say, has made organizational separation. And this is a fact of life now, that these are, there's arm's length regulation between the safety regulator and the provider of air traffic services, just as there is between the operators of the airlines and the mechanics and pilot licensing. So it's all arm's length. As Marla said, over 50 countries have created some form of air traffic corporation. And all of those that are real corporations are self-funded. In other words, the funding has been depoliticized. It comes from the customers directly to the corporation that is the provider, whether it's a government corporation or a private nonprofit or a partial public-private, as in the UK. And that refocuses the focus of the organization on what the customers want, especially if they have a governance model that represents the customers and stakeholders as the governing board, which is especially the case in Canada, but it's also true to some extent in the UK. So those are the kinds of things that are going on in other countries. The group at Business Roundtable is working on fleshing out the details of a plan and of actual proposed draft of legislation that is intended to be ready by early next year when Congress starts holding hearings on reauthorization. And so we're very actively working. I'm also involved with the ENO project, and I think they're working very much in parallel with a slightly different focus, but with the same objective of creating a sustainable system that really works for the aviation customer and stakeholder community. And so look forward to all the discussion that we'll have.
Thanks very much. Over to you, Ed.
Hi. Well, thanks, Sean. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to be with ALPA. We have an opportunity to work together on a large number of work groups around town, and I think our collective efforts have been strong, and I think this is one more example of that. Sean mentioned in his opening remarks the importance of NextGen, and I think while there may be some disagreements on this panel about some of the tactics, I think there is complete unanimity in terms of the goal, and that is getting to NextGen. The business aviation community has been a primary advocate for NextGen because we see it as an essential part of the United States staying the world's largest, safest, most diverse, and most efficient air transportation system in the world. When we started on the NextGen path, we had an idea, we had a concept that said if we could go from ground-based navigation to satellite-based navigation, and from analog communication to digital communication, that we would open up a lot of opportunities. Opportunities that would allow us to enhance safety because we could enhance situational awareness. We felt that we could reduce our environmental footprint by having more direct routes. And we felt we could increase the capacity and the throughput, the efficiency of our system by having things like more precise spacing. All of those goals, those concepts, I think had widespread support, but as we have moved toward development and implementation, we've begun to recognize that this is no easy task. And I think Sean put it out pretty well when he talked about the idea of trying to change the tire while the car is moving down the highway. And I think one of the things that we all agree on is that we want to make sure as we do this evolution, the car does keep moving, keeps going forward. It doesn't stop and it doesn't go backwards. And as I said before, today the U.S. has, by any empirical measure, the best air transportation system in the world. It's the largest, the safest, the most efficient, the most complex, the most diverse. And our challenge now is to stay the best. How do we need to evolve? Where do we need to go from here? How can we best get there? A lot of people have suggested that the way to go forward is to look outside of the United States and follow some of the models that have already been discussed. And certainly the business aviation community, the entire general aviation community, is looking at all the alternatives out there and trying to evaluate them. But as we do that, again, we don't want to lose sight of where we are, how we get here, and how we preserve the system opportunities that we have now for everyone going forward. For business aviation, access to airports and access to airspace is fundamental to the future of our industry. And for a lot of small towns and rural communities all across the United States that depend on business aviation for economic development and for jobs and for humanitarian lift, that access is vitally important. One of the reasons business aviation has been so aggressively in support of NextGen is because we have seen historically that when airspace and airports get congested, business aviation tends to get squeezed out. You know, some of you may remember back when Midway was largely a general aviation airport. Kind of the same thing with Fort Lauderdale, San Jose. There's a lot of places where the space got busy, the airport got crowded, and business aviation began to be in secondary and tertiary locations. We believe that it's important for the future of our industry that we be able to have access to the airspace and the airports, and we think this transition from ground-based to satellite, from analog to digital, is fundamental to getting there. We want to be careful, as I said, not to go backwards. We know that there are challenges associated with the current governance structure. We also know, however, that when you look back over the past 15 years, the FAA's funding stream has been remarkably stable in a very unstable time. If you think back over the last 15 years, the United States was attacked on 9/11. We went to war in 2003. We stood up the entire Department of Homeland Security. We faced one of the greatest recessions in our nation's economic history. And there have been a few things like hurricanes and oil spills and other challenges that have been out there. Throughout that entire 15-year period, funding for the FAA has been flat or gone up every year. The general fund contribution has been robust. So as we look at alternatives, we want to make sure it's a clear-eyed evaluation. We understand where we're all trying to go, and we understand how we can get there together. But I think sometimes it's easy to look and say, junk what we have, let's do something big, let's do something bold, let's do something radical. That may be the appropriate response, but there may be a better alternative. And we want to have that conversation to make sure that when we have meetings with ALPA 5 years from now and 10 years from now, we're always able to begin by saying, today the United States has the best air transportation system in the world.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. One thing that you emphasized, Ed, is that in all the work that we do, and we all sit on a lot of mutual advisory boards and technical committees and working groups and everything else, I think that, especially when you look at a board like, I think folks kind of come in from a much more kind of performance-based and outcome-based objective, as opposed to a lot of other groups where you have folks vending a particular piece of equipage or, something which is, something that prompts them to kind of stake a position and kind of draw a little bit of a line in the sand. But I think that the one thing we can all agree on is that we have to do something, regardless if we just refine the system that we have or if we take a much more kind of transformative approach. With that in mind, Mel is right in the epicenter of where all this change is happening. He's actually one of the agents of change management, and he's also the fella who makes sure that the car still stays on the road, doesn't back up, and doesn't park while they're changing the tires. It's thanks to the controllers. Over to you.
Thanks, Sean. And it's a blessing to be the representative of those 20,000 bargaining unit members that are making sure the car doesn't stop. So really, I've been doing less of watching the car, individual cars, and watching more proverbially the freeway and the highways of the system. But with that said, just to reflect, I appreciate the title of the panel. I'm sorry, the title of the presentation and the opportunity to represent NACA. If you think about it, really, we want to talk about the trajectory of modernization. We want to talk about some of the potholes that we see now and that we believe we'll experience along the way, and then the promise. So never, having been one to shy away from tough problems, let's just laser in right on the potholes for starters, and I'll talk a little bit about the begin and the end parts of the panel. On the pothole side, it doesn't take too long for us to, as aviation members of the aviation community, to really distill down in very short order that there's two basic perspectives. It's almost a tale of two stories of modernization. As soon as you start to look at it in depth at all, you see that the scenario that plays out perfect timing with last week, the EAA event in Oshkosh, where you have this just incredible, robust desire of general aviation community to participate in the airspace. And then this week where we have this group of union airline pilots that operate the aviation's transportation hubs. And those are really the bookends or the two ends of that story to say, how do we modernize a system that has that much diversity? That clearly represents a very significant pothole. How do you even define you're going to modernize both ends of that, or both a system that feeds both ends of that spectrum? Another way to look at it is if you change your perspective a little bit, would say that we've got this core legacy infrastructure that exists and has existed, like Sean said, for many, many years, and it's very resilient, very robust. It's actually fairly efficient. If you look at the cost to operate the current system versus how we are compared to our peers around the world, we are very proud of the fact that it's an efficient, both from a cost perspective and capacity perspective system. So that's one aspect of modernization, is how do we maintain or sustain those core components that are necessary to be there far into the future. Or you look at the leveraging the satellite-based capabilities, and you say, okay, we can't have all of one or all of the other. We need to somehow find a way to meld the capabilities of both pieces of, or both components of the system. So again, a tale of two stories, two very large potholes, depending on what perspective that you use to view them from. So let's back up and talk a little bit about the trajectory of airspace modernization, or NextGen as it's currently branded. There's been significant efforts over the years to do that, whether it was free flight or Air 2100 or Air 2000 or something like that, depending on the current branding. Airspace modernization is NextGen. I would say one thing that's critical to me to communicate to my membership on the ground-based side of the microphone, and I'm sure it's critical to communicate to Captain Moak's membership on the airborne side is what's the key, what is the role of the human element in the far term of NAS modernization or airspace modernization. I think one of the great places to look to answer that question is, what are the airframers doing from a human factors perspective? What is it that they're going to ask the pilots of the future to do? And that question would lie in, what are they investing in human factors research today? And significantly, Boeing announced, again, it's significant to this argument, didn't get a lot of airtime, was that they had essentially zeroed out the line item for human factors funding for airborne self-separation. So what they're saying is, as an airframer, as a major airframer, is to say that this initial concept of far-term NextGen was that there's going to be super high levels of automation, and it's just going to be controllers sitting back and watching and controlling by exception, right? Becoming more air traffic managers, and pilots coming back and just being more systems managers. There is a deep recognition that there's a strong human role in even the far term of whatever this modernization effort is called now or will be called in the future. And you can see that across the different modernization plans of the worldwide ANSPs, the service providers around the world. They all adhere to an essential block upgrade system that accepts the fact that there's going to be a large amount of human interaction for many years to come. So that's kind of the trajectory of modernization. So I'd say, considering the potholes, it's a good trajectory, and it's realistic, and there's a lot of promise that's built in there that's achievable. And so it goes to the last part of the title of the panel, which is, what are the promises? One of the things that Captain Moak has been very vocal about is, let's take those things that we know that we can do and do them now. Let's fast forward those benefits. Let's prove that we've transitioned from research and development to implementation, and then that'll buy us some time or buy us some bandwidth to do those more aggressive things down the road. And I would say that the initial net that was cast across airspace modernization was everything from low-end GA to very high-end commercial high-density operations, and the research and development put on the table for the implementers significant benefits in each one of those areas. And so what we've done is things like wake turbulence recategorization, where we see significant throughputs on the order of laying in a new runway. They call it a throughput increase equivalent to a virtual runway, 37% throughput increase at some places. So taking that and doing it everywhere that it's relevant within the NAS, that's what Captain Moak's talking about, those types of deployments or implementations. So we've talked a little bit about the potholes, talked a little bit about the trajectory, talked a little bit about the promise. I think for NACA, what we recognize is that we have a foot in each one of those worlds, regardless of the perspective. So what we see is a very robust aviation system in the U.S. that we participate in at 3 of the 4 levels, really the 4th level being the uncontrolled airports, the low density GA airports. But other than that, whatever we decide to do as a country as we move forward is to ensure that all 3 or 4 of those levels are protected and maintained. So stable funding when it comes to modernization, critical, absolutely critical, especially when you start to talk about the more complex programs that are going to take 5 or 6 years to deploy. We've got to stabilize that funding. But of primary concern for us and our membership and the members here in the room operating on the flight deck and those wonderful, wonderful people up at EAA last week is that we've got to recognize that this is a very diverse system that does not exist anywhere else in the world. So we have to do it very methodically. So I, again, look forward to the conversation and absolutely to your questions.
Let's jump right into it. Go ahead, Bob.
I'd like to
This is what I like.
challenge a little bit something Ed said about stable funding. If you look 5 years ago at the FAA's official projection for what the facilities and equipment budget, basically the capital budget that is for modernization, would be by this year, by 2014, it was $1 billion more than the actual amount that they have to work with today because of the overall federal budget pressures. So, well, it may be stable in terms of constant levels, but it's not at the level that was planned for serious investment in modernization. And that is why the NAC is having to do triage, having to say, well, we wanted to do this and this and this, but now we have to focus on only the things that we can do near term that have short-term benefits, because we don't know, we, the FAA, don't know what our funding is going to be next year, let alone 3 years from now or 5 years from now. And the difference between that and the self-funded corporate model, however it's organized, is that if the money is depoliticized and it's a bondable revenue stream, then air traffic corporations like NAV Canada, like NATS, like Air Services can issue revenue bonds just as electric utilities do, just as railroads do, just as airports do, and fund and finance the big capital programs, get the money in place where it's needed now, and then pay for it out of the ongoing revenues as users experience the benefits. And that is a model that's how airports do their capital programs. That's how almost all of the other air navigation service providers these days worldwide in developed countries do it. We are the only country that's still trying to fund a major capital modernization program, basically out of annual cash flow, that is not determinable in advance. It's only determinable by each year's appropriations process, which is limited and constrained by the overall situation of the federal budget. I mean, looking back 15 years is fine, but you've got to really look forward 15 years and say, what is the condition of the federal government? How much money is going to be available? What kind of across-the-board budget curtailments are there going to be? Sequester, by the way, remember, is a 10-year program. We got a 2-year reprieve so that the cuts are not in effect last year and this year. But after there's 8 years still to come of sequester unless Congress can come up with a new overall budget fix. So we have a very serious funding environment in which we're trying to modernize and get the benefits to keep our system the best in the world. And in some of these technology areas, we actually are falling behind. Canada has nationwide controller pilot data link in en route airspace. It'll be a decade, fingers crossed, before we have that here. There's things like satellite-based oceanic ADS-B. FAA was invited to be a lead investor and get that off the ground. And there's no way they could make a decision because they would have to have appropriated funding that comes into play several years from now. There's no way an organization on the federal budget can do that. So, I mean, there's things like that I think we really need to take into account, and that's what's driving a lot of the effort for looking at a big change, big funding and organizational change as opposed to just minor reforms.
Well, I think there are several different ways to look at the funding issue. And certainly, the FAA's internal projections of how much money they would have right now is a fair way to do it. What I simply did is went back 15 years. And I could have gone back longer because I recall, as far back as the 1997 reauthorization debate, there was a lot of conversation about the funding system being broken,
right.
The general fund going away, that it wasn't sustainable. But if you look at that, each and every year, if you had said, I bet the FAA's budget will be at least what it was the year before and potentially go up 1% or 2%, you'd have been entirely accurate for 15 years, despite an incredibly uncertain environment out there, which, as I said before, involves wars and attacks and recessions and so forth. And that's not to suggest that what we have is perfect. But a lot of times people make it sound as if it simply can't function. It's totally debilitating.
It's functioning. I completely agree that it is functioning. I think it could do a lot better, though, based on seeing what other countries are able to do. Admittedly, they're smaller. Admittedly, they haven't had the same kind of history of. We have been historically a technology leader. I think, that's questionable. Today, it's certainly questionable looking forward over the next decade. Not that we aren't inventing new things, but being able to implement them and get the benefits from them, I think is very much open to question.
Well, I think there is a chance. Certainly, we see products get manufactured. They need to be certified. And we've had some challenges at the FAA, working through the certification, working through the approvals. But a lot of what we're talking about when we talk about air traffic control reform is we're talking about the air traffic system.
Yes, no, sure.
And one of the things that we've seen in the business aviation community, particularly as we've become more international in nature, and that's certainly true over the last 10, 15, 20 years, what I consistently am hearing from operators is when we fly around the world, we come back and conclude that from the point the wheels leave the pavement to the point the wheels touch back down, the United States is the system where we think it is best to operate. I want to be clear. Where we are today doesn't mean that's where we'll always be.
Right,
It doesn't mean
right.
we shouldn't change and evolve. And in fact, we've been at the forefront of articulating the need to evolve.
Yeah.
I just want to be a little bit cautious with the all is broken. Sometimes it
Yeah,
seems to me that maybe with regard to funding, it may have worked better in practice than one would have expected in theory. Right? I mean, it has been pretty stable for the last 15 years, and that doesn't mean Sequestration doesn't change that. But it also doesn't mean we can take it for granted that the funding won't be there.
Right.
And there's an interesting, maybe an anecdote that would help maybe inform both sides of the debate, assuming that that's a debate format.
This is a
Sean.
This is a self-moderating panel. This is the best one for me. I just sit there.
Perfect. If you look at, I alluded to what the other ANSPs are doing worldwide from a concept perspective, and I alluded to what Boeing's doing from a flight deck human factors perspective. Well, let's look at what's really happening. If you take a look at maybe most people would characterize the most advanced PBN, performance-based navigation-based system, and most people would point to Australia. And they've done a great job at deploying significant levels of PBN, and they are reformed. I'm not exactly sure which model, but thank you. Was it their government corporation? That tension between the regulator and the operator, the ATO, right? Their version of the ATO is there's intense tension there now, to the point where there's depending on who you talk to, they're about ready to revoke the certificate. So from a modernization perspective, if the funding is stable, are we deploying the technology on a system-wide basis at the right pace? And so what I'll tell you is that if you look at their highest density hub, Sydney, my understanding is they're shy, or they're not as aggressive there as they are at the spokes. And so I think there's certainly things that we could do better and faster, but we have to be careful to not rush too far forward. And so my point there is that both stable funding and a reformed relationship between the ANSP and the regulator doesn't guarantee success when you transition to high technology.
I want to follow up a little bit too, if it's okay, Sean.
Go ahead. Ed, you go, and then I'm gonna have a question for Marla right after that and pull her in the conversation.
All right.
Go for it.
Sometimes it's easy to blame Congress on funding issues. But I also think, when we started the process of NextGen, there was a lot we didn't know. And there's always been a sense, well, we're ready to do NextGen now, it's just a matter of funding. And I think sometimes as we've gone through some of the panels at an industry level, we recognize, boy, we need to really be careful here. We don't necessarily know. And so in some cases, I think what I've heard from Congress is, we'd like NextGen. We want to be supportive of NextGen. What do you need to make NextGen a reality? And I'm not sure the FAA or even the FAA and industry together have always consistently articulated that. I don't think we've always said, gee, if you give us an extra $1 billion, here's what we'd buy, here's when we'd deploy it, here's the benefits we'd receive. That was particularly acute to me when we went through, following the Great Recession, there was a stimulus package, and there was talk, well, what do you want to see in the stimulus package? And while we were able to put some things forward, I don't think anyone in industry felt we were as crisp as we would like to be about saying, we want to do this at this price, look for it to be certified, implemented, and paying these benefits on these dates certain. And so I think, while there's a lot of frustration with our evolution to NextGen, there's also a lot of learning that has been going on.
I agree.
One of the things that we're doing in the Int'l board, and this is well-traveled ground for us and probably a lot of folks out there, is when we look at these potential models for moving NextGen forward, the first one's basically a status quo model where we say either leave the FAA as is, business as usual, or a variant to that where we say take that FAA function, the ATO function, and have it still live under DOT, under the federal agency. So that's kind of basically the first option. The second option is the one that Marla just kind of hinted on. That's the government corporation, something tantamount to Amtrak. And as soon as you say the word Amtrak, people just, you know. And
say TVA, that's a little better.
TVA, okay,
That's a
TVA or
utility,
Amtrak.
it issues bonds.
But so it changes some of the architecture of the governance and decision-making process, but it still really doesn't resolve the funding issue because it's still buried in the appropriations, the federal authorization, and everything else.
To an extent.
To an extent. And then that tends to kind of drive us towards the third model, which is, you know, the ANSP, the NAV Canada, the fully privatized model, because of the way you can go out and seek capital elsewhere rather than have to go through Uncle Sam to do that. But the question I have, and I'm going to start with Marla, is there another option that's kind of a hybrid where we can have the architecture, we can have the decision-making, and still create a line of funding that is not subject to as much handling on the part of the government?
I don't think any funding model like that has ever been demonstrated to work in this country thus far. I mean, we've had a number of trust funds. We currently have an Airways and Airports Trust Fund that was actually not created to pay for the entire system, so it is working as it should, partially general funds. But looking at every other trust fund within our country, they don't work. They haven't been sustainable. And so sitting up here listening to this, I've been thinking, is there another way to fund this within the federal government? And one option potentially could be there is a precedent for having appropriations a couple years in advance. I believe it's the National Public Broadcasting Company. They have appropriations 2 years in advance. But that might not solve the problems either. You know, we could appropriate money 2, 3, 5 years in advance, but are we going to have enough funding to be able to modernize our system? And we still would not have bonding capabilities at that point either.
Yeah, I think a key thing is having a revenue stream that permits and facilitates bonding for large-scale capital programs, which is what every airport in the country, every large airport certainly, the airports that you guys fly to, has as a matter of routine, and so does every other utility, including TVA, which is government. But I think that is a fundamental thing. Doing large-scale capital programs out of annual cash flow, especially when that cash flow has to come from appropriations in a very uncertain, going forward budget climate, just as a recipe for continuing problems. Whereas a bondable revenue stream, and these are investment-grade bond ratings, so mind you, air traffic control, there's not competitors there. It's a monopoly. And so the investment community says, where do we sign? I mean, if you have any kind of credible bonding proposal, they will love to fund it and give you the money and have a reasonable assurance of annual debt service payments. And why not take advantage of a structure like that when it's readily available and works in other countries, works in other industries in the United States that are also vital, essential infrastructure, including the airports. Mm-hmm. So there's an awful lot of precedent there. It's just not like stepping off a cliff into the unknown. We know this kind of model works for toll roads too, which I do a lot of work on. So I think that's a key part of the reform conversation that's really going on, is to learn from that kind of an example. Here's one other part of this, though. And when John Crichton, the CEO of NAV Canada, addressed I think it was the May meeting of the ENO project, one of the things he pointed out to us was that the question of access, remote airports and so forth, is something that NAV Canada has to confront also. And there are two ways to go on that. One would be to ask the government for an explicit subsidy because those things don't pay for themselves. The other would be to do it, to cross-subsidize it internally and charge enough to the customers that can afford it to cover the costs of the things that don't pay for themselves. They decided on the latter very deliberately and very specifically because if they asked the government for partial funding, then all the controls that we're talking about that are a problem for FAA, of reporting to at least 6 congressional committees, having the budget have to be approved by OMB, and you can't ask for what you really need, you only ask for what OMB will approve, having the GAO looking over your shoulder, having the Inspector General, as opposed to a governing body of the customers, the stakeholders, saying yes and no about the policies. As soon as you have taxpayer money, you have all the oversight things. And when I talk to senior FAA officials and retired ones who can speak more freely, they say again and again how much top management time is taken up by responding to all these overseers and constantly having, I mean, they're required not only go and testify occasionally, but every time an Inspector General gives a report, they must by law respond to all the recommendations and so forth. That takes a lot of time. And you talk to them candidly off the record, and they'll tell you that. That's not how you should be running a business. It really isn't.
I'm sure a lot of people are going to probably grab David Grizzle here and pigeonhole him after those comments. So just a reminder, we have about half an hour left for the panel here, and I do want to make sure that you realize you have the opportunity, if you have a question that you'd like to bring up. But I'm going to still keep the conversation rolling because I'm sure Ed has something to say.
Well, I think it is probably clear to everyone, but I want to make sure it doesn't get lost. When we talk about bonding authority, we're talking about borrowing. Right. We're talking about borrowing a sum of money today and paying it back over a period of years. And usually when you go to borrow money, you want to have a very specific idea what it is you're buying.
Absolutely.
And that's why I think it's important as we talk about NextGen that we understand where is it that we are and what exactly do we want to do. If we're going to go borrow $1 billion or $10 billion, what are we going to buy? What's it going to give us on what date certain? Because the users are being asked to pay for it. And if you look at what we have today, let's say the FAA has roughly $16 billion. 13 of it comes through the user taxes. About 3 of it comes through general fund appropriations. Assuming that the system is $16 billion going forward next year, that means if we privatize the system, then the $3 billion goes away, and we've got to find a way collectively to pay for that $3 billion that used to be the government. And then we've got to look for the additional money. We need to be pretty sure, I think, before we as an industry take on $3 billion to break even and additional money to move forward, we understand what is it we're trying to buy, when are we going to have the benefits, what are the other costs associated with it. Doesn't mean it's the wrong way to do it.
Right.
But again, the idea that we'll just borrow our way out of it and pay for it later is something we need to be a little cautious about.
But there's two things that I feel I need to say, and then when we talk about the deeper nuances on the borrowing and where are you buying piece, maybe we can get back to that depending on how Sean wants to do it. But what I'd say is the simple answer to your question, Sean, is there another model? There has to be another model. There just has to be, and really I believe that firmly, that there has to be another option at least to discuss. There's 2 words that convince me, and one is liability, and the other is responsibility. So on the liability side, you look at the mitigation, the cost to mitigate a lot of the legacy infrastructure that's out there, the VORs and whatnot. You probably pretty rapidly approach a funding liability to mitigate the legacy components that could equal a Superfund site, right? And there's a reason that we had a Superfund to go out and do some cleanup stuff, right? So that's the environmental responsibility or liability. There's insurance liability. They're saying that to look at the cost to insure the operations of the NAS, there's not any one insurer in the world, and maybe not even a conglomerate of all the insurers in the world, that are willing to take on the risk of operating or insuring our NAS operations. Another liability. Third would be pension liability. So pension liability is no stranger to anybody in this room. And if you look at the pension liability associated with air traffic controllers, it's fairly significant. So all that has to be factored in. So those are your liabilities, right? There's the 3 of them. Responsibility. Going back to the GA side, one of my alma maters, little dirt strip down in Southern California called Chino Airport in the middle of a cow field, and that's the Plains of Fame Air Museum. And there's learning that's going on there, and the responsibility, the relationship between air traffic controllers and student pilots is we covet that relationship and the responsibilities that are inherent on both sides. You look at some stuff that happens as a result of the Nav Canada model, where there's a co-located airstrip with a lake. It doesn't cost anything to land on the lake. So they're more often than not sucking those wheels up and choosing to land on the lake to save a user's fee. Or if you say there's some significant weather in the northern part of the U.S. and we pick up the phone and call Nav Canada and say, could we divert some flights? Well, what's it going to cost? And then you decide not to divert. And so those are negative pressures on that responsibility side of an air traffic system and pilots working together to operate as safe as possible. So, Sean, I'll turn it back to you and just say that I think that we have to really think deeply about all of those nuances.
Yeah. Great. I have about 3 more questions that just came up from that discussion, but I'm going to go back. We could do this panel for another couple hours, ma'am.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm Deanne Divis. I'm with Inside GNSS Magazine. We cover satellite navigation, which of course is absolutely essential to NextGen. One element, though, is the civil funding out of FAA for GPS monitoring has been cut repeatedly. This session, though we haven't gotten to the conference committees, the House zeroed it out. The Senate cut it by about more than a third. It's going to delay monitoring, as I understand it from what I've been told. My question to you is twofold. One, what have your organizations done, if anything, to follow up or monitor this? Because without the monitoring, you don't have the signals in the long run after GPS modernization. And so for the current structure, are your organizations looking at this issue? Have you weighed in on this issue? And for the future structures that you're talking about, how would this kind of funding be integrated into what you're talking about? At current, it's coming through FAA, but it's not happening from Congress, and in some cases, it's been actually delayed by FAA itself because they've got a lot of pressures.
So I have a tidbit. I think that's probably not much more than that. It would be characterized as not much more than that by any expert in the room, and then I'd certainly pitch it back to the panel. But what I'd say essentially, what I hear you talking about is alternative position, navigation, and timing. If we were to say we're going solely GPS-based system, you have significant liabilities that are associated with that when we start to look at the fragility of the satellite system, whether it's from solar flares or missile attacks or denied environments, those types of things. So there's some puts and takes occurring within the legacy infrastructure versus satellite-based infrastructure that's assessing that, because we still have a robust legacy ground-based infrastructure. The timing piece, or that reliance on alternative to position navigation timing, that dependence, if you will, on the satellite system isn't as significant as it would be if we've already shut down 90% of the ground-based stuff. So that my guess is that those funding decisions, that balance to say, okay, we need to fund that. We need to be better sure that we're going to get what we need out of the satellite-based system. Those types of things are more easily delayed. Those more difficult decisions, because we still have this legacy infrastructure that we could fall back to and say, okay, we're just going to go back to radar vectors and ILSs. Again, it's a tidbit. It may not get right at the heart of what you're asking, but that's, I believe, at least partially why you would see delayed or deferred funding.
Let me give you a little bit of a different perspective on it. I think one of the things that really puts this into focus is RPAs. There's a congressional mandate for RPA, or at least to have an integration standard by the FAA by September of 2015. And when you think about it, the only way we're going to have integration, especially more broadly up into the NAS, is that if we have very stable signals, very stable satellite-based signals, communication signals, command and control signals. And the only way that's going to advance is if we make sure that we protect those signals and that they're robust, because after all, RPAs have wireless pilots. There's nobody inside that aircraft to do something if there's some kind of a system failure. Looking at more systemically, kind of tagging on to what Mel just said, one of the things that we've also been participating in addition to all the NextGen stuff, is making sure that as we go to a more space-based system, away from a ground-based system, we still have some of those legacy pieces of hardware still in service for when we have the solar flare activity, for when we have some kind of thing that kind of takes down the signal or disrupts it. And that's why we're never going to be fully only space-based NextGen. We're just kind of looking to strike the right balance. And as far as funding, I mean, we're always playing a game of triage, trying to, push priorities forward and advocate for the things that we think are nearest and dearest at this point in time. Otherwise, if we keep on saying we need money here, we need money here, we need money here, we're just trying to boil the ocean, and we'll lose our effectiveness, right? One of the questions I have, was there a follow-on question?
Well, the monitoring is part of the new ground system. The ground system is essential to the new GPS-3 satellites. Can't work them, gotta have it. And you can have the ground system without the monitoring, but the monitoring is essential for the aviation component for NextGen. So it's going to be happening over a period of time. It's not like it's tomorrow, but if you change the structure as you're discussing, the financing structure, are you going to incorporate this kind of funding for this? Because it is essential to make NextGen work.
Sure.
Yeah, I think if you look at the investment priorities of the reformed ANSPs worldwide, they're generally the pacing items become where are the airframers at, what's the legacy infrastructure, and what's the deployment strategy. And so I think a logical answer would be that yes, they would reconcile that. Maybe more rapidly than the federal government would because of the other liabilities I talked about, but they would reconcile that.
Thank you.
Thanks. So one of the questions I have, and we've been talking a lot about money, right? But one of the questions I have that I'm going to throw it to the panel here is when we had the sequestration hit and when basically you had a 5% cut that basically got, put over a smaller chunk of time, which essentially turned into a 10% cut, right? 4 functional divisions in the FAA, research and development, airport improvement, facilities and engineering, then ops. The problem became is that you had a consistent 10% uniform cut right across all the different lines of business. And anybody who has had experience managing any kind of business or their own household budget, if you said, hey, you got to cut 10% out of your finances, you wouldn't take 10% out of the mortgage, 10% of your car payment. You might skip landscaping or something like that, right? So in one respect, we talk about the overall amount of money, but in the second one, we talk about the use of the money and the management of the money. Can you comment a little bit about lessons learned from that experience?
Well, I'd say that, I'd be curious to hear Ed for sure's perspective, outside looking in. And I would say watching the FAA executives wrestle with the difficult decisions that they were forced to make was not pleasant. But I would say Michael Huerta, the current administrator, is very accurate in pointing out that the FAA is a wonderful operational organization. We do ops. Ops is our job, and ops is our business, and business is good, right? We're not a real great planning organization. So I think you would naturally default, if you were in his shoes, to say, I'm graded every minute of every day on ops. And I would naturally, if I was given the choice, strike the 10% from modernization, which would be the entire budget, right? Essentially, so you just totally abandon anything towards modernization to do today well.
That's what a lot of us feared would happen.
Yeah. So Sean, I'm not sure it gets to the heart of it, but I'm sure it wasn't any more pleasant for anyone else to watch it than it was for me. But Ed, any thoughts there?
Well, I think flexibility is important. I had a opportunity last week to be in Oshkosh and hear Michael Huerta talking about the FAA and the upcoming FAA reauthorization. And I think he laid out 3 key priorities for the FAA as they move forward, and that is stability, funding, and flexibility. And I think that gets to the heart of what you're bringing up there, Sean, and that is you want the ability to prioritize when you can't do everything. And so I think everybody understands that. I think the feeling would be, gee, let's make sure when we're doing the prioritization, our guiding principles are right, and we're putting the money where they can best serve the broad community. But certainly flexibility will be a key part of the FAA reauthorization debate, and I think that's appropriate.
Another problem that hardly ever gets mentioned is that there's a looming deferred maintenance
Right.
problem with
Yeah.
FAA. It's several $1 billion according to GAO and growing, because that's one of the things. It's one of the things that's easiest to put off when when funding is tight, and you've got operations that you have to maintain, and you're trying to do as much modernization as you can. Well, okay, the deferred maintenance, let's leave that till another year, and that's how it builds up over time, and that eventually that has to be coped with, and there's no plan that anybody that I know is aware of for doing anything about that, except hoping that things will be better somehow in the future. And that's not a plan.
And I think that these are the real reasons that everyone came to the table for our working group, is after experiencing 2013, we had to find a better solution to be able to fund our system.
Yeah, absolutely. That was the one thing that the group could clearly, I was kind of
Yes.
joking about Mason-Dixon lines and everything else. The one thing that the group clearly agrees upon is we have to do something, because we cannot relive that nightmare again.
Yeah.
We can have a situation where we're relying on 23 CRs to keep stable funding levels. We just simply cannot do that. And we certainly can't have a situation where we lay off a bunch of controllers and then start lowering the capacity of the airspace in order to maintain aggregate safety levels.
And potentially shutting down a lot of small towers.
Right. Right. I believe you were first?
Thanks, Sean. I'm John Rosenberg with Delta Airlines Air Safety Committee, ALPA. I think my question might be directed more appropriately to Mel. And this, Mel, has to do with an equipment question as far as NextGen. And it's my understanding now that FAA has put out a mandate for aircraft owners that by 2020, now we have to have our airplanes equipped with ADS-B out, which then, of course, places a pretty good-sized burden on the airborne side of it, meaning we have to have the airplane, you know, from a financial standpoint, equipment manufacturing standpoint, and of course for the avionics shops, and to gear up for the influx of installations. So my question is, from the ground end of it, will you guys, you know, based on all that I'm hearing about funding issues, and I hear the word languishing, will the ground end of it be in sync with the requirement to have that by 2020, you know, along with the airborne part of it? Will you guys be ready for that?
It's a great question, and it really, that the mandate has been a driver, a strong driver of the ATC modernization side. So we look at, there's currently, it's embarrassing to admit that we have 98 facilities that still currently use monochromatic radar screens. And we send our best and brightest individuals through universities in these incredible labs that have three-dimensional, 360-degree, three-dimensional, the equivalent to a motion-based, high category simulator, and then we deploy them to a facility where they say, oh, by the way, here's your black and white TV. Now you start needing radar vector. So it is a monumental lift to force in 1-second updates that ADS-B will provide into the ATC automation systems. It is way harder than we thought it would be. But we're certainly on pace to not only meet that, but be well ahead of it. And the result of that will bear fruit in many different areas. Classic example would be the tension, the constant tension between radar surveillance and route structure, right? Could we put routes closer together? Well, you think about, a 1,000,000-pound airplane flying at 500 knots. You don't want to get too close, but could we, right? Yeah. So 1-second updates and what we call fusion now, where you start to look at areas of terrain and you see much better what's going on down near the ground, or eliminate gaps in radar coverage. Some very exciting stuff that's going on, but I'll tell you, there's some people working real hard on the ATC side to meet those mandates.
Thank you very much.
You bet.
Hi, Ben Strutton with ALPA Air Traffic Service. Speaking of deferred maintenance, is there any more talk about combining air traffic control facilities? I know there's some political roadblocks to that. But
Yeah.
it seems like a
the
good
base
thing to do.
realignment, what was it? No.
Yeah.
And the technology really is driving some wonderful opportunities, right? There's a reason why facilities were located very close to their radars, right? That doesn't exist anymore. We're geo-independent. So the geo-independence of the technology then allows you to have a discussion, an honest discussion, unconstrained, about what's the right density deployment roadmap look like? And so politically, what we have said as a union, as an organization representing employees, is now's the time to have that discussion. Maybe even 5 years ago is the time to have that discussion, and we've been participating in it for that long because we're literally resetting a generation of the workforce. And so if one of your political roadblocks is, I've got 2 kids and they're in school and my wife says we're not moving, now's the time to, okay, there's a lot of guys that have gray hair like myself, and there's a lot of incredible young individuals that are just starting families. So there's no better time politically to have that discussion. There's no better time technologically to have that discussion. The discussions are ongoing. Then what you start to come back to, and Bob, will be a softball for you, buddy, is the constituent situation and the political representation and those types of things. That's my tower, and it's in my backyard, so I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to leave it for Bob. But yeah, we're all in on this one.
Right. No, that is a real political constraint, because members of Congress really hate to give up even a facility that has 2 people in their district. I mean, it's jobs in the district. They just live and breathe to protect those, and yet, as Mel says, the technology now makes it possible, and particularly since so many of these facilities have so much deferred maintenance needs, they really should be replaced. But if you replace all of them where they are today, we're going to waste a fortune, and we can't afford to do that. So coming up with a sensible consolidation plan that puts all new facilities, or in many cases new facilities, to replace several old facilities, really makes sense. And now, as Mel says, now is the perfect opportunity, the time to plan that, and to hire people with the idea that they're going to need to be flexible in where they're going to work 5 years from now, and so forth.
And the last thought I'd have, and maybe Ed has something to add to it from a business perspective. I was the facility rep at the Southern California TRACON, which is no small facility, when the wildfires burned right up to the side of the building, and the janitor literally saved the day by turning on the sprinklers, the irrigation outside. We went ATC 0 for 3 days. We deployed to nearby locations and maintained. We limped along, I think, about 80% ops or whatever for 3 or 4 days. That type of, we've got to maintain that type of resiliency, because there's just too many things that could happen. But regardless of whether I'm thinking public or private, I'm looking to you, Ed, from an investment perspective. It is not easy to justify buying a bunch of new stuff, and it is. There's been invested a significant amount of money inside FAA to evaluate all of that, and what's your return on investment, and those are heavy lifts, which you're talking 20, 25 years before you see a return.
Well, I think the interesting thing is even Congress has agreed we need to move forward with consolidation. We need a consolidation plan. If you look at the last FAA reauthorization bill, there was a section 804 that called on the FAA to come forward with a consolidation plan. And I think everybody in industry supported it. I think even NATCA supported it, because we recognize exactly this conversation that's going on here, that we need to build for the future, and that may mean taking steps away from the past. It means consolidation. And I think the part that is missing on this is exactly what does that word mean? How do we get there from here? What's the plan? What's the cost? What's the timing? And I think all of us have urged the FAA to move forward smartly with a plan, share it with the community, and let us become advocates for it. And so we're hopeful that will happen soon.
I think I had the good fortune to actually visit one of the first ERAM facilities stood up in Salt Lake, and it was pretty phenomenal. They're going from what they call the host system, the legacy system, the scopes, the monochromatic scopes, and the physical pieces of paper going back and everything else, and going to a fully digitized system where if you were to have a crisis like that, a forest fire, some kind of natural disaster, you can basically switch the full control function from one facility to the other one, which is just an absolutely phenomenal thing. I think that's another great example of some of the redundancies and resiliencies that are being built in through the use of this technology. So.
Yeah, that core infrastructure going in is critical and fortunately flexible enough that we'll be able to leverage it later. And I think that becomes that point where what is your definition of next gen, and where are we on that continuum? I think I would say, if you think about the 20-year cycle and the $20 billion taxpayer dollar investment, We're about 10 years in and about 5 or 6 billion, 5.5 billion or so. We've got a lot to show for it. We've got a lot of great core infrastructure, a lot of great opportunities. It's the, what next and when and how type of thing is probably the biggest argument, based on perspective.
I wonder if a safety case can be made for happier and safer controllers at a facility that's not dark all the time. And if you've ever seen some of the Scandinavian air traffic control facilities, it looks like an IKEA with hardwood floors and a fireplace. So
There is certainly a level of culture there that was required or developed out of a requirement because of that real low light situation. But you're right. Once you are exposed to options, generally you see some incremental benefits, and then they start to pick up a little bit more rapidly. So there's a lot of facilities that look that way now, and once we deploy those nice bright scopes, my guess, or nice bright monitors, not scopes anymore, we'll see those changes, yeah.
cool. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. You hit on incremental changes, and one of the big frustrations that sometimes we all share is the fact that we keep on talking about NextGen with this kind of mythological connotation, like it's something that's very futuristic, and maybe we don't spend enough time focusing on the incremental changes and the improvements that we're making right now. So I guess kind of getting back to the opening conversation that we had when we started off the panel, we're talking about funding, we're talking about decision-making, governance, and everything else. Are we actually making enough incremental change right now through the deployment of the technologies, the changes in the policies and procedures? Metroplex operations, taking a bunch of different airports in a physical, a nearby location and harmonizing the flow in and out of the airport. That's happening right now. And they are realizing benefits.
Oh, yeah.
Mel mentioned RECAT. We can talk about equivalent lateral spacing, options there to create the density, maintain the safety. Are we doing enough right now that we should really just keep on riding the wave, if you will, or do we have to go back and look for a more transformative kind of approach?
Ed? I have a lot to say, and I'm very enthusiastic. I'm certainly by no means an infomercial, but I'll tell you, I'm sorry, but what I say is one of the kind of fatal flaws, not fatal, one of the potholes, right? We're talking about potholes. Was what was your perspective going into it? Where are you in history, and what is the attention span of the average person in the U.S. right now? It's about 1.5 minutes or 2 minutes, right? Squirrel. No, it's really tough to maintain enthusiasm in relation to, or to maintain perspective, right, of where you are in history. So I'd say there are incredible efficiencies that are literally at our fingertips and could be populated through, or could be dispersed throughout the NAS and done immediately. It's do you do that now and abandon some of the more advanced concepts, or how do you balance that? It's really tough.
Yeah, I think to your point, Sean, there are changes happening all the time. Whether it's reducing vertical separation minimum, one day we flipped a switch and we effectively doubled the capacity of our air transportation system between flight level 290 and 410. So change does happen. It is happening, and we don't always talk about it. We don't always highlight it. But frankly, the American DNA is never to be satisfied with where we are, right? And so I don't think anybody's satisfied with where we are today or with the pace at which we got here. We want to do more. We want to do better. And I think all of us here are committed to doing that. What we're talking about are structures that may give us the best opportunity to move forward. And in doing that, my point has been, let's not lose sight of the fact how far we've gotten and where we are today.
Good point.
But we have in our DNA, we want to go farther, we want to go faster, we want to go safer, we want to go more efficiently. We want to be the world's best. And hopefully dialogues like the ones we're having today will keep us there.
I wanted to take a little slightly different spin on that, and there's another kind of change that I think has been very important and very positive in terms of NextGen, and that is the NextGen Advisory Committee. This has brought great diversity of aviation stakeholders to work together and reach some kind of workable consensus on a whole array of issues. And I see that process as something, we really never had that before. In all the history of previous air traffic reform, we've had different parts of the aviation stakeholder community in disagreement on various aspects. And I think, I see the NAC as the first time, in my memory at least, that the whole aviation stakeholder community has figured out how to work together in the toward the greater good. And it doesn't necessarily get everybody's first choice of everything, but you reach workable compromises that move the ball forward and everybody can live with. Mm-hmm. And I see that as kind of a prototype for what a stakeholder board of directors could be. That it's not going to have as many people as the NAC, but a much smaller number of them representing everybody to do the same kind of process, but as a policy, not an advisory, but a policy-making body for a reformed air traffic system and air navigation service provider. I think there's a lot of learning that's gone on in that process that shows this is really, it's not inconceivable, which it might have looked like 10 or 15 years ago, but it is conceivable because we've seen it work on this kind of a scale.
Any comments, Marla?
I would just echo what they had to say. I think that we have made some strides, but in the American DNA, we can do better, and we have seen other countries do better than us, and I don't think we're ever satisfied with that.
Yeah, well, my experience from working around the NAC and being on the NAC subcommittee, it really lines up with what you just said, Bob, because my sense is that when I first got there, we had a bunch of different stakeholders looking at 35 different core programs and technologies associated with NextGen, and it's basically like asking 40 people what kind of flavor pizza they want, and you're going to get 40 different answers. And that was the kind of frustration that I certainly bore, and I know these folks here did too. And it wasn't a technical issue. It was not a technological question. It was a leadership and prioritization question. And I think looking in the context of what was happening in the agency is important as well, because we had an interim administrator wearing a bunch of different hats. We had some folks kind of coming in and out of the line of business, and now we have a full-time administrator. We have a deputy administrator who's one of their core focuses NextGen. We have the assistant administrator in charge of NextGen who opened up our conference yesterday, General Bolen, and we have leadership and we have decision-making actually happening to the point where now we're kind of funneled in towards 4 core priorities for NextGen. Surface operations, datacom, closely spaced runway operations, and PBN. And I can see a palpable difference between the first day I walked in and started kind of getting immersed in this stuff to present. Because sometimes at the end of the day, money's always going to be important, but sometimes it's more important to discuss how you use the money. Technology is really important, but sometimes we're dealing with non-technical barriers to move this process forward. So, at the end of the day, it comes to leadership, it comes to stable funding, it comes to vision, and it comes to having folks who have that DNA, that get-it attitude, that makes sure that we continue to be the safest, most high-performance, air traffic system in the world. We were talking a lot about Norwegian Air Shuttle and all kinds of things about maintaining our competitive advantage. In my neck of the woods, it's equally important that we do so with regard to how we manage our airspace. So I have exactly 1 minute left. We're going to have an on-time arrival so I don't get in trouble with anybody. I'm looking forward to our next speaker and the closing ceremony. And please join me in giving a hand to this panel. I hope you enjoyed it.